and welcome back to the 6-5 Summit. I'm Shelley Kramer, one of the founding partners of Futurum Research, and on behalf of my team at Futurum and the team at More Insights and Strategy, welcome. We're glad to have you. In this spotlight session, Futurum's Daniel Newman sits down with Jonathan Ross, the CEO of Groq, for a fascinating conversation about Grok's origin story and the company's growth over the past few years. It's not every day that a company emerges in the software industry and is immediately in play, but that's what Jonathan and his team at Groq have done. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to hear this story and more about what's ahead for Groq. Let's go take a listen.
Jonathan Ross, CEO of Groq, welcome to the 2021 edition of the 6-5 Summit. It's great to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this event has really exploded. It went from a day and 1 hour last year to 5 days, 50 sessions, and some really exciting and unique new companies. And I put Groq squarely in that category. I've been following very closely, as you probably saw, a lot of semiconductor companies here, a lot of leaders in the chip space here. You guys are doing some really interesting work, and I'm going to introduce everybody to Groq who doesn't know who you are. But I also always find startups really interesting in companies and those that are taking those startups off the ground, you being the CEO, founder. Let's start off with you. What's your story? How'd you get here?
Well, yeah. So I started off as a software engineer. I never intended to get into hardware. And I ended up at Google. And around 2012, something interesting was happening. Actually, Jeff Dean was getting ready to give a presentation to the leadership team. It was actually just 2 slides. And the first slide was good news. We actually can do speech recognition and translate speech to text better than human beings can, right? Machine learning finally works. Slide number 2, the bad news, we can't afford it. We would need to double or triple our global data center footprint. That was another 20 to 40 data centers at the time, an average of something around $1 billion each. And that was for speech recognition. If they wanted to do anything else, it was going to cost more. And so they had a problem, and they called it the success disaster, right? So I happened to be working on a 20% to get speech recognition models working on FPGAs. And that ended up becoming the Google TPU effort. So by 2014, we had chips back. We put them in the data center. By 2015, more than 50% of Google's compute was actually running on TPUs. So more than half of their compute was actually running on this other hardware.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy story. And somehow, though, explain how it got you here. So you were working on that. You suddenly became kind of a designer of a semiconductor that was enabling the next wave of development of machine learning for speech recognition. And now you are running Groq. What happened in between? How did we get here?
So I took about a year working in Rapid Eval, which is the group at Google X that comes up with the other crazy ideas to do, worked on all sorts of things. But fundamentally, I just kept getting drawn back to semiconductor. I think semiconductor has had an unfortunate reputation for the last 20, 30 years of becoming this very stale industry. But the number of layers that you get to work on, there's just so much room for innovation that it just kept drawing me back. And so I decided, to leave, to do something new. I had no idea what it was going to be. We started talking to venture capitalists, and all they wanted to know about was, machine learning accelerators. It started to become a thing, and I'd already done that. I wasn't so keen on doing it again, but that's what every conversation was about. So started thinking, what can we do to improve, upon what had been done before? And the realization was, no one had built an accelerator that was easy to program. CPUs are easy to program, right? But you have armies of people who are writing code by hand to optimize for accelerators. It's one of the big bottlenecks in the industry. Everyone is struggling. You can't find enough people to hand code. It's funny because even as few as a couple years ago, if you change the name of a game, the binary, then your performance would plummet. Because what happened is in the driver, they would have all this hand-tuned code that would be emitted when they saw that video game, right? But it was all hand-tuned. So the realization was that that wasn't going to scale, and we needed an automated way to do this. So at Groq, we actually spent the first 6 months working on a compiler. We actually forbid ourselves from thinking about the hardware. And only after we had a compiler that worked did we start considering what kind of hardware we could actually build.
So basically, the VC community kind of introduced you to a problem, and they didn't realize they were sort of asking you to do something you didn't really want to do. But in the course of that, they kind of almost created the idea of Groq.
Yeah. In my background, like I'm, pathologically incapable of doing the same thing twice. I always want to do something different. And so I just kept thinking, I've already done that. So then had to come up with a different way to do it.
Okay, so you spent the 6 months, you built a compiler, but now what is Groq now?
All right. So where Groq has evolved to is historically, if you look at the chip industry, every couple of years, the number of transistors has doubled, right? Everyone's familiar with this. This is Moore's law. What's been recent in the last 20 years is the number of chips have doubled every couple of years. So you've got the transistors in each chip doubling, and you've got the number of chips doubling. So you brought up exponential growth. Well, actually, this is more than exponential growth, right? Because it's the square of exponential. And I think a lot of semiconductor companies have missed that, and they've focused a lot on the chips, but they haven't thought about how the chips connect together. So what we've done is we've built a chip that very specifically is designed to have a large number of chips come together and work on a problem quickly, finish, and then work on the next problem. And so this is called, the main issue is called tail latency. And the way to think about it is if you were to go to a restaurant and you didn't have a reservation and you weren't going to get seated until your entire party got there. If you have 5 people, you might be waiting a little while. But if you're inviting your 100 closest friends, you might not get seated that night. And that's the way that it works with large scale data center deployments today. They actually have to do all sorts of work to work around the fact that if one of the machines is slower, which they are, in order to give results quickly enough, right? So we focused on that larger problem.
All right, now I'm going to come back and ask you to talk a little bit more about that probably later on as we get into some of the trends in technology and in your future, because I want to get to that. But one of the things that I think is always really interesting is, I think clearly the market, now that you've gone through multiple series of venture raises, you've got some very significant investors backing this. So the idea of companies, investors are obviously always an indicator, but the idea in something like semiconductors, where the companies that are players are so rooted, they're so well known. It's not like software where, things come out of the weeds. There's a handful of players. There's a handful of general purpose. There's a handful of GPU. There's a handful of FPGA. It's not every day a new semiconductor company, raises from the Phoenix, and is suddenly in play. You guys have interesting enough shown up. What were sort of those catalysts? What are some of those bridges you had to cross so that people are like, okay, we're going to give you a shot. We're going to work with you?
Well, when we first got started fundraising, no one was seriously thinking about investing in semiconductor. And if you think about it, there's a reason why. Actually, people don't even invest in software companies. What they invest in are network effects. And the benefit of a software company is that there's very low cost to achieve that network effect once that network effect is found, right? So occasionally there's an industry that's growing so rapidly that even without that network effect, people want to invest in it. And somewhere around the first, I would say 6 to 12 months of Groq is when people started to realize, and that's around the time that Google announced, the scale of TPU and so on. Somewhere around that time, people started to realize that there was a shift to this new type of computing device. And that opened up the floodgates, right?
So when that opened up, though, you're basically saying, the investors came through the door, the customers came through the door.
The investors, and so the customers were also very hungry. One of the other things to keep in mind is, after doing the TPU, a large number of hyperscalers and other companies approached me to build something similar for them. And the realization was that meant that what the large companies, the Intels and the NVIDIAs of the world were building wasn't meeting their demands. So you could have looked at it as you're going to have a bunch of competitors, but the reality is it meant that there was a lack of product market fit for what was being built. So instead of going, I'm going to go to one of those companies and solve it for one company, the idea was let's solve it for everyone. And the realization is if you look at the cost to train a model, to take these models to production called inference, it's staggering, right? We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And what we decided to do very early on, if you look at something like GPT-3 and the fact that it costs like $12 million to train it once, that just wasn't going to be something that everyone else was going to be able to follow, right? The researchers can't even always repeat the research that's published from these large companies, right? So our mission very quickly became what we want to do is we want to drive the cost of compute to zero. It doesn't mean you won't pay anything for the compute. What it means is you'll get so much compute per dollar that it might as well be free. And we want to, a lot of companies have a 10-year plan. Some will have a 20, some will even have a 30. We have an infinite roadmap, right? Because we're always going to be trying to get closer and closer to zero.
Which is a really interesting approach. And I'm guessing that the market's been pretty positive in the sentiment. But like I said, I definitely admire anyone that comes into this space and takes on what I would consider to be a very established, strong market leaders. And, we're seeing some disruption, of course, in architectures right now. You guys are certainly participating, and we're seeing it in other ways. And it's going to be fun to watch. We had the different voices of almost all these companies actually here at the summit. So it's been a really fascinating week of hearing from all these folks. One of the things from the moment I started talking to folks at Groq that seemed to be such an overwhelming point of focus was talent. It was about who you are going to bring into the firm and finding the right people, almost as if the technology itself has been spoken for. People get it, they understand it, they like it, they want it. But in order to keep developing and work towards that cost zero of compute that you want, there isn't infinite talent, and there isn't an infinite roadmap to finding the talent that can do this at scale. Why is that? Why are you so hyper focused on talent, and how do you find people that fit into your organization?
That's a great question. So the first thing I would say is, if normal chips take about 400, 800, sometimes thousands of people to build, and there's just a enormous quantity of specialties, and there's so much work that goes into it that it's a massive, gargantuan, slow-moving effort. If you want to do something different, though, it's really hard to get 400, 800, 4,000 people to all go in a new direction, right? Every time we hire someone new, no matter how open-minded they are, no matter how willing they are to try something new, we have to overcome a lot of these internal biases, right? So we knew very early on that the only way we were going to be able to be innovative is if we kept the company small. So our focus is on talent density, because if we can build a chip with a small number of people, then we can also change the direction of those people very quickly. It's also something that the large companies can't really replicate, right? Even if they tried to create a small effort internally, there would be antibodies. Everyone would be like, why aren't I on the small effort? Aren't I special? And so our focus from day one has been greatest talent density possible. And I think we taped out our chip with about 40 people in total at Groq, including software, including non-engineering positions as well. And that's just incredibly unusual, but especially for a chip as large as we produced. And also, given that it was A0 silicon, we didn't have to respin it. We got it right.
So basically, you're saying the magic recipe is finding people that are 10 times more productive and completely willing to work on something that is semi unproven. And I'm being a little facetious, but reading between the lines. But I've definitely heard some of, I believe it was Amazon, Jeff Bezos early in his career, basically he had kind of made a similar statement though about levels of productivity and finding people that could work at effectively exponential rates, using that term again in this conversation, versus what your typical worker can produce. Obviously, all these semiconductor companies have brilliant minds that are helping to develop some incredible technologies that are fueling so many of the things we do every day that we probably take for granted oftentimes. I often say semiconductors will eat the world. Some people say software, but you know what? Without semis, no software is running anywhere. So, but you couple that though with then the difficulty, Jonathan, of finding people who also say, okay, I'm willing to try something. I'm willing to take my brilliant mind and put it towards something that doesn't necessarily have the same market acceptance today. And the formula of trying to identify those two things concurrently, the best minds and the most willing, is a very challenging formula, which I imagine is probably making your ability to find enough talent to take you to the next wave one of the biggest day in and day out stressors in your work.
So if you want to create a great dish, you have to start with quality ingredients, right? But there's no such thing as a perfect ingredient. That'd be ridiculous, right? I mean, sometimes you want Doritos, sometimes you want some really expensive cut of meat, right? Depends on the dish you're building. And the dish that we're building here, in order to do innovative things, everyone thinks you need smart people. And that's true. They have to be smart. The thing that's missing in most technology companies is empathy. Because innovation is fundamentally, as a team sport as opposed to individual, is about change management. It's about getting people to let go of the way they've done things in the past. And so we look for people with empathy, who understand why people are asking to make a change, who don't instinctively react and say no. We like people who say yes and rather than but. And the other thing is, when we're talking to people, we tell them straight up, look, this is a startup. Startups fail. If you're looking for safety, this probably isn't the right place for you. All we can promise is that there will be problems. But that's what we're promising. That's why you should join, right? If you like to solve problems, this is where you should be. And those are the sorts of people that we look for. And if you think about it, the reality is you go back to something like Black Swan, Nassim Taleb's book. The idea that there is an investment that isn't risky is an illusion. Every investment is risky. If you look at office spaces, people have to get insurance for fires. No one had to get insurance for pandemics, but over the last 200 years, 1 out of 50 business days, you couldn't go into an office because of pandemics, right? So we miss these huge risk factors, and we don't realize that, hey, you work for a company, maybe your boss changes, and now you don't want to work for that company anymore. And that can have a bigger effect than whether or not the company's going to stay in business. So the reality is there's risk everywhere. But some people are looking for the opportunities to take on a challenge, and that's who fits well in a startup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that the Black Swan analogy. I also like that you point out what I feel every day, and everything has a varying level of risk. I always said that, as tough as the pandemic was on people, some people didn't like the idea that, hey, you might have a probability of dying on the way to the hospital that was higher than you actually had a probability of dying from, the virus. And I'm not, by the way, in either say playing up or down. What I'm saying is math is kind of one of those things that some people kind of like and some people tend to not like. But the point is that with everything you do every single day, you're creating risk. Every time you walk out your front door, you have a certain amount of risk of something happening, every time you make a change in a company and there's also, what do you call it? Kind of like dominoes, right? There's domino effects of everything you do. You make one hire, who then makes two hires, who makes, there's that effect down the chain. You roll out one product over another product, and there's a series of effects that creates. And yeah, to your point, you might invest in, what you'd consider to be one of the safest stocks. You might invest in a fund that has never lost money. And everybody remembers 2007 when you couldn't go wrong investing in real estate. And it turned out you could. And in fact, we're actually with the state of inflation right now. I'm sure you'd appreciate this randomness in our conversation, but I think there's a lot of things you could invest in right now and get completely wrong that look like really good investments. So I like that. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to circle back because let's get to the human elements and tie them back to the technology trend. You're building a purpose-built solution. We hear a lot about ASICs. There are big cloud providers building ASICs, which I would consider a purpose-built solution. But you're taking a different approach at building a purpose-built. Why is this a trend? Why is Groq in a good position to take advantage of this?
So it's a trend because most of the compute now runs on accelerators. Most of the cycles in the world performing computation are now being performed on accelerators. They're not being performed on CPUs anymore. So the world has already moved this way. And when that happens, it's a gold rush. And of course, everyone wants to get their slice of the gold rush pie. And of course, in order to do that, you have to do something a bit different. So, going back to what we were talking about earlier, large companies have a lot of inertia in ways that they do things. And, that if you want to do things the way you've done them, that's a great place to be. But startups are where impact happens. And one of the things that we're doing that's different, I think, than most of these other folks, we're actually not building highly specialized hardware. And actually, if you were to do that, you would fail. And the reason you would fail is, unlike the workloads that CPUs and GPUs have been defined for the last 10, 20, 30 years, the software benchmarks aren't 20 years old, right? It used to be that you could design for 20-year-old software. With machine learning, I've designed chips where the benchmarks that we were using were all deprecated by the time we taped out the chip. So you have to build for generality. And the question is, what are the things that are common across the machine learning models across the last decade, and target that? And that's a really difficult thing to do because you have to do that better than these other relatively general purpose bits of hardware. But again, if you build something specialized, it takes 6 months to a year to deploy hardware. And if it's specialized, that may no longer, whatever you specialize for may no longer be in production by the time you get there. So you have to think ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes that's the appeal to the FPGA. You can make those modest changes. Of course, you're talking about something a little different with what you're doing, but I'm saying that flexibility to update because you are seeing that, and it is very resource intensive, which kind of takes us full circle to why so few people enter this space. Is the resources to stay up to date with process. We're all seeing the leapfrogging that's going on, and then you're seeing new packaging and architectures that are being designed to try to stay ahead, to try to deal with the expected complexities to make general purpose computing continually attractive. And also, you're seeing the architectures that are being built that are supposed to help the cloud providers building these custom, application-specific chips and being able to get them out, rolled out, deployed quickly enough to take advantage of market forces and trend, which is where I'd love to end with here. What are those workload trends that you're identifying that are giving you so much confidence that you're on the right path?
Well, so the first thing to keep in mind is that the workloads are different than software, right? And so going back to that previous point, in software, a human being wrote it, so it's probably going to stay the same for a little while, right? They don't want to keep rewriting it. With machine learning, you have things like AutoML, right, where the models are retrained sometimes on a hourly basis, and new software programs or models are generated on the fly sometimes every couple of seconds. And so the biggest trend that we're seeing is the fact that machine learning models are changing over the course of seconds, right? We've never had that with software before, right? Software, you could rely on it for those 20 to 30 years. Now, it might be 20 to 30 seconds if you're lucky. So compile times have to be super fast. So you brought up FPGAs, for example. One of the areas where they struggle is in speedy compilation. And that's really going to be a huge problem for them going forward. For GPUs, everyone has handwritten these kernels. The state space can't really be explored efficiently, right? Because it's only what people have thought to optimize for. So the biggest trend that we're seeing is that speed of compile. That's becoming absolutely critical. And then, of course, enormous amounts of parallelism, much more than we've ever seen. It makes the amount of parallelism that GPUs are built for look relatively serial in comparison. But linear algebra, fast compiles, and the ability to try things that haven't been done before are all becoming much more important than they were.
Which is awesome. And I think by the end there, you got down to just under 1% of the population fully comprehending. But that's why we depend on smart people to create things that are going to take us to the next level. And I say that sincerely. Like, you started this conversation talking about building a compiler, not a semiconductor, because what you actually identified was a trend. And the trend you identified was, in order for us to actually do what you're thinking about doing with these purpose-built semiconductors, the first thing you had to do was be able to compile faster so that you could actually roll these out with the speed to keep up with these opportunities in the market. So it's actually a really great story, full circle. Jonathan Ross, CEO of Grok, I'm super excited to have you join us here at the 6.5 Summit 2021. I'm hoping you and your team will have you back next year.
All right. Well, great to meet you, Dan, and thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Well, everybody, you heard that here. Fascinating stuff with Grok. Just raised another big round because what the company is doing is very interesting, very exciting. We will be tracking it closely. You'll hear more from us for this show. I'm going to have to say goodbye. But remember, all these sessions are available on demand. It's day 5. We're coming to the end of the event. But we really appreciate you tuning in. Share it with your friends. Keep watching the sessions you may not have seen so far. And we'll see you again really soon. Bye-bye now.